Hey, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Ashley for doing this and to Ori for hosting us. This is the last homeschool event of 2018, so it's bittersweet but also wonderful. We've had a long year, we're tired. We all need a break. I'm sure everyone can relate. Today, Homeschool and Ori Gallery are excited to present a talk by Ashley Alexandra Johnson, who is the founding fellow and program director of Birthright Africa. This is the final engagement of the 2018 curriculum. Joining us remotely from Accra, Ashley will discuss her work with Birthright Africa, how it led to her moving back to the African continent, as well as the Year of Return, which is the Ghanaian commemoration of 400 years since the slave trade began, and the roles and opportunities that she sees for what she calls badass, or Black American descendants of American slavery and sharecropping, displaced diaspora on the continent. Cool acronym, but Birthright Africa is a foundation which gives youths and young adults of African descent the opportunity to explore their cultural roots and legacies of innovation. Legacies of innovation through educational travel on the local, national, and international level. As founding fellow and program director for Birthright Africa, where she ensures effective operations of experiential travel and project-based learning opportunities for fellows and scholars on the African continent. Ashley holds a BFA from Columbia College, Chicago, after transitioning from the University of Chicago, where she briefly studied anthropology. As a native of Chicago, Ashley was prepared in her youth to serve her role as a woman for others through her Jesuit education. She supplemented her schooling by volunteering in a local soup kitchen and a local battered women's home in a largely underserved African American neighborhood in Chicago. The daily juxtaposition of these two environments and the realities of her service background had a profound impact and impassioned Ashley to engage her skills in public service. Upon graduating in 2007, this is like a life story, so it's awesome. Upon graduating in 2007, Ashley taught an African garments and textiles course at the Anthony Overton Academy, at the time Chicago's most underfunded grammar school in the city's poorest neighborhood. After a year, she moved to Mexico City, where she re-engaged in textile arts, working at an atelier and showroom designing garments. I promise that right. In 2012, Ashley continued her fashion career, moving to New York City, where she worked as an independent designer and consultant for various brands and celebrity clients. Industry in New York City in 2015 for New Orleans, where she began her work with Walla El Sheikh, founding Birthright Africa at the start of 2015. Ashley has since relocated to Accra, Ghana, where she has served in the Birthright Africa program, in addition to being a startup entrepreneur. Yeah, Unbox Africa, you can talk about that. I heard about that the other day. And so for those who don't know, Homeschool is a free pop-up art school in Portland that I run with Victoria Ann Rice. We provide welcoming context for critical engagement with contemporary art and its problems. The curriculum featuring artist talks, exhibitions, monthly classes, poetry readings, and more. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ashley. Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. That's true. So I want to thank, before I start, I want to thank Manny, Homeschool, and Ori Gallery for inviting and hosting me tonight. Like Manny said, I am in Accra, Ghana right now, so it's 3:00 in the morning. So I just woke up again. So please bear with me. I should be okay, but you never know. Things happen at this hour. Before I start, I want to know if there are any things that people would like me to touch on or discuss, and I can sort of work in those things as I go. I don't think I can hear you anymore. Or is just no one saying anything?
Sorry, I muted the mic because the feedback produces audio issues.
Okay.
I'm just curious to hear what brought you to move to Ghana. Sorry.
Okay. Anything else? Or? Okay. So, like Manny said, I'm Ashley Alexandra Johnson. I was born in Chicago, um, and I grew up in the South Side, and where basically in Inglewood, Chicago, which is at the time was considered one of the most dilapidated neighborhoods in Chicago. There was not a lot of positive or progressive stories that um, I heard about or learned about as a youth growing up there. So there wasn't really a lot of vision for what my future could be as far as who I could be or who the people around me were could be. Um, Although I did have an educated father, my dad was actually a Rhodes Scholar who was very adamant about my education, which was very good. But he also struggled because even though as an educated man, he was never able to work outside of manual labor. So that sort of shaped the way that he parented me and the things that I was encouraged to do. Um, I always knew I was a creative, but he was tried to strategically like steer me away to things like accounting or um, career fields that he felt were going to be more that you can make more money in, which was just not who I am. I have an older sister who's 10 years older than me, and she was an accountant. And I think that that sort of colored a lot of like those things. But um, it just wasn't who I was. I always knew as a creative, I like to draw, I like to dance, I like to sing, I like to make things. So um, that was sort of in my youth, that was really formative for me that that these creative outlets didn't exist in my community for youths like myself. Um, so when I was in eighth grade, I actually had a white teacher who encouraged. He was actually like one of those like white people who everyone, the one who has like probably black friends and is probably the one who would check white people, I would imagine, in a context of like how we operate today. But he encouraged me to go to St. Ignatius High School, which was very far outside of my community, but it was a Jesuit high school, um, which I should say I went to Catholic school basically my whole life until college from that stress on education from my dad. But he encouraged me to go to St. Ignatius High School, which at the time was one of the top two or three high schools in my state, and they had really good academic programs. Um, and so I ended up going there, and it was like very different from where I grew up. There were a lot of white people. I didn't even know any white people before that point in my life. And I was dealing with sort of like a lot of issues just regarding like race and things like that at that age because those white kids also hadn't met a lot of black people. So there was a lot of like culture clash, and it sort of informed how I was navigating that system. Um, I think that the school was like 1,200 students, so it was very, very small. And all of the black students in my grade would all sit at one table. The girls would all sit at one table, and the boys would all sit at another table. And then the rest of the cafeteria was white. So um, it was definitely that kind of experience. Although I, although it was not pleasant, I will say that it was very it was very it was something that helped me form and inform like who I became in the future in a lot of ways. Um, because I just was thrown into a situation that a lot of Black people did not get to experience at that time, because not only was the school mostly white, but a lot of them were extremely wealthy, and I was coming from this poor neighborhood. And so I would leave like the ghetto every morning and then go to like this like school that is like appraised for millions of dollars. It's one of the oldest buildings in Chicago. It survived the Chicago fire. And be around these kids who are driving the school in like Bentleys and Jaguars and Audis and things like this. Um, and there was a lot of like growing pains with it, to experience like, okay, there's like a disparity of life, like, um, but it was also really informative because, anyway, I'll keep going. But yeah, so that was basically like what it was like for me through high school. So um, when I went to college, I started at the University of Illinois at Chicago for anthropology, and then I switched to fashion design at Columbia College. So uh, I was able to sort of more get into my creative groove and be creating and be around other creatives within my city. And um, I met a lot of friends that I actually still have to this day there. So that was really nice. But after I finished school, at the same time, actually, in between school and finishing school, I met a circle of friends who introduced me to some people who lived in Mexico City, and we became friends, and they invited me to Mexico City to work in their atelier. Um, it was a young man at the time named Rafa Cuevas, and he had a clothing line called Te Amo. So I went to Mexico City and I worked in his atelier. And I was there for about 6 months. And I always like to say that living in Mexico sort of like helped me know how to live in Ghana, because Mexico is obviously, like Ghana, a developing nation. Um, and there's just a lot of infrastructure and just a lot of things that are different than how um, we are used to it in the U.S. and also the ways that we are viewed as Americans when we're abroad. We're sort of like brought up then, that I was able to sort of um, deal with at that time, that makes the transition here easier. But yeah, so I lived in Mexico City for about 6 months. That was a lot of fun, but it was also pretty nuts. That was actually like at the height of the time where a lot of the news cycle, was broadcasting a lot of information about the cartels and kidnappings and things like that. So I had a lot of my family who was very, they had their own ideas about whether or not I should be doing that or whatever. But I've always been a person, like, my friends are always like, oh, where are you going now, what are you doing now, because I just do what I want to do. But I I enjoyed that time in Mexico, and it helped me really to understand how to live abroad in a developing nation, and it really helped me be able to live here. But after I left Mexico City, I moved back to Chicago for a short time, and then I moved to New York City because I really wanted to continue to pursue fashion on a higher level. Um, I ended up starting my own consulting company, basically helping people get from A to Z, developing their own fashion lines. And that helped me get another job where I was doing high-end client work for celebrities and things like that. I think that by now the NDA has worn off. Like we were doing stuff for like Beyonce and Lady Gaga and et cetera, Prince and all kinds of people. So that was really cool. But I also got extremely burned out on fashion really quickly because as a Black woman, people were really feeling entitled to my time. They were feeling like that they didn't have to pay me for my work. Um, and they would, of course, say things like that, like, well, why should I pay you for this? And it's like, well, because you want it. I don't, if you don't want it, then you don't have to pay for it. But if you want it, then you have to pay for it. Um, so that just really wore on me really hard because I was living in Brooklyn, and New York is, of course, like extremely expensive to live in. I had my own company, I had other side jobs, freelance jobs, and I was working 7 days a week. And I was making like decent money, but it was like coming in and going right back out. And I just didn't feel like that was a sustainable lifestyle. And so I decided to it was actually sort of like at the time spurned by the death of a really close friend. Um, I ended up leaving New York City to move to New Orleans because that's where my friend died. And at the time that he died, I had actually called him a week before he died after we hadn't spoken for a couple of months, looking for someone else actually. And to say that I wanted to travel to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. And he was like, I'm here. I'm here. So you should just come anyway because we can hang out. And I was like, I'm definitely coming now that you're there. So then, like, he died like a week later. And all of our friends ended up deciding that we should still all go to Mardi Gras and celebrate his life. So I ended up going there. I ended up loving it. And I ended up leaving New York like immediately after. Um, so I was in New Orleans. I got to New Orleans in early 2014. And it was sort of in New Orleans where I started being more active in activism circles. Like I had always gone to like protests and marches sort of casually, although I will say that my ideology has changed a lot around that process. But regardless, um, I, um, that was at the time at the height of like Black Lives Matters marches, and there just were a lot of things happening in New Orleans at that time um, on so many different levels for me that just like it just had me like ripping at every end. Um, on a personal level, I was working in restaurants. I just started waitressing. And the place that I worked at, they had two racist cocktails on the menu, one of which was called the Traded Triangle. And then there was another drink called Mixed Melancholy, which was a watermelon Negroni named after a black barback. And um, I was one of the few people who was extremely vocal about the bar manager and general manager who had named those cocktails being held accountable for it. And this was at the same time that they were doing protests and sort of activism around taking the Confederate flags and General Lee's statue down in New Orleans. And there were clashes with the KKK, and Alton Sterling had gotten killed, and a lot of my friends had gone to Baton Rouge and gotten beat up and tossed in jail. Um, then on like a spiritual level, I had sort of started to become really interested in African African and diasporic traditional religions, and my sensitivity and intuition, and all became extremely heightened. And I also was just, so there was just like a lot of environmental, spiritual things that were going on around me at that time. And it just, I was just screaming like inside. It was just like on a chaos loop. I was just like, what is going on in the world? What's going on with me? What's going on around me? Like, these people are demons. Like, it was just really, really, really intense to deal with. Um, and this also coincided with the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, which had been being planned. I mean, I won't say it had been being planned, but um, about a week and a half before it happened, the job that I was at that had these cocktails had actually come to the conclusion that they should finally hold the GM accountable in a public space. So they held a meeting, which I had been the one who pushed for it for so long. And in the meeting, he was allowed to say that he had never heard of a connection between Black people and watermelon. So how could him naming watermelon Negroni after Black Barback be racist? And exactly. And he also said that the traded triangle wasn't a reference to trading slaves. It was a reference to an obscure rum trading route. And it was like, but what were they trading the rum for? Um, so it was very strange because it was like you held this meeting to hold him accountable, but you're now letting him like literally dodge accountability in the corniest ways possible. So I actually at one point during that meeting, oh yeah, there was also I didn't write this in my notes, but there was also at that place a white man who told me he was going to slap me because he like wanted me to mop after him, which obviously, like, you know, if you work in a restaurant, like you have your side jobs or whatever, and his side job was to sweep and mop, and he like was insisting that I did it, and I said no, and he said he was going to slap me, and I was just like, I don't know if you're going to slap me. I really don't think you're going to slap me. And then that same GM told me that if things like that happen, I should just do them and I shouldn't say anything. So at that point, I was just like, oh, okay, like I see what time it is with you, sir. Um, so there was a lot of things going on right then. So at that meeting, I actually had to remove myself from the room, and I went into the bathroom and I cried for like 10 minutes, and I was just like, this is like not real. Because I mean, I grew up in Chicago and I went to this school with white people, and like I had seen things and heard things. I mean, it was just a different sort of racism, right? It was like a different kind of racism. It was like, here's a white man who's threatening to beat me up at my job, and here's my GM telling me that it was my fault he did that because I didn't. Anyway, so I came back into the meeting, and basically the one person who was able to verify that he did in fact know that that he did say that it was a slave trading route had actually showed up late to that meeting. So she was unable to say anything. The Black Barback, who that cocktail was named after, had actually forgiven them. He was the first Black person in his fraternity. And he said that his fraternity had Confederate flags up in their fraternity house. So he just was not prepared on any level to be dealing with any of that stuff. Like he just was ready to let it all go and to tap dance away happily. They actually ended up firing him, which I thought was funny in the end because it was just like, well, that's what you get for having no backbone. But I left that meeting and I got sick for 10 days straight. Like I was literally throwing up every 15 minutes for 10 days straight. Um, and I lost probably like 20, 25 pounds. Um, there was also a break-in in my building. I lived above a restaurant. There was a break-in in my building of the restaurants while that was happening. And I mean, I can't say if the person who did it was or was not trying to break into my apartment, but I do know that I was inside of my house completely delirious from not having any food or liquids inside of me for days on end. And it would have been really easy to like kill me. This is also at the same time in New Orleans that there were 4 serial rapists in my neighborhood. Um, People being attacked regularly. And I mention that because New Orleans is actually in some like sort of covert way, people like to say, oh, Chicago's really violent, Chicago's really dangerous. But New Orleans actually has 3 times the amount of like gun violence per capita. And I think that that is strategic and planned, that people don't know about that. Um, New Orleans has I should say the people of New Orleans are deeply traumatized people. And they are vast majority Black. Um, there are no services to help anyone. The desperation and despair of Black people in New Orleans is like some unheard of level. Like I have never seen anything like that before. And it's because people are so traumatized. You have the Angola prison there where something like 75% of the prison population is there for life. Everyone in New Orleans knows someone in Angola. Um, the county jail is also a prison. So if you get locked up for peeing in public, you're going to go to jail with rapists and murderers, and um, things happen to people in there in OPP. Um, there are neurotoxins in the water, so literally, if you're drinking the tap water, it is degrading your mental facilities. Um, and yeah, so yeah, New Orleans was really a tough place to live in. So these things are all happening all at once. And I had gotten sick for 10 days straight. And my fever actually broke as the parade for the commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina passed my house. Like I could hear it coming. And then as soon as it got outside of my house, I I was like, okay, I think like I hadn't thrown up for a few hours or something, and I was just like, okay, I think I can go out and march. So I went outside, joined the parade, um, and I just like broke out in this crazy sweat from the top of my head, and it was just like gushing down my head all over my body. I was like soaked, and I'm like not a sweaty person naturally, so like the fact that I was like sweating, like it was like my fever had broken, and it was just so it just had this like strange, powerful feeling that it was just happening with this commemorative parade of the 10-year Katrina of Hurricane Katrina, um, which had actually started at the point in the lower Ninth Ward where the levees were blown up. And people like to ask me a lot. Not a native New Orleanian. But people have asked me when they find out that I have lived there if the levees were actually blown up. And of course they were. Um, Everyone in New Orleans, everyone who's from New Orleans knows that they were blown up. So um, the parade for that actually started at the levee that was blown up. in the lower Ninth Ward. So my fever had broken. I ended up going back to work. The stupid ass girl who was managing was like, "Oh, did you miss us?" And I was like, "Are you crazy? Y'all are the reason why I was sick for 10 days." I was so mad. I was like, "Why are you asking me something silly like that?" So I ended up having to quit that job because the environment was it was a hostile work environment. Um, and at the same time, I ended up doing some work with becoming friends with a woman named Nisi X. She's the founder of the Black Women's Defense League. And I became a member of that organization. And that organization was profiled in Vice, in a Vice documentary, which some of you may have seen because it got really, it went viral. The organization does a lot of work in the community. They do literacy for the elderly. They feed the community. They do makeovers and job training for homeless women, and et cetera, et cetera. One of the main things they do is rescue battered women and having resources for women who have survived sexual assault. But what was the sensationalized part of the organization is that they train Black women to use firearms to protect themselves. And so I would encourage you all to check that out. It's on YouTube, the documentary about Black Women's Defense League by Vice. And Nisi talks about her story of how she started that organization. She initially was with an organization called the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, and she's from Dallas, Texas. And she was dating a member of that organization, and she ended up becoming pregnant, and then he ended up abusing her, and she lost a child. She went to the leaders of the organization asking for accountability. They basically brushed her off, and then she ended up having to examine why an organization that claims to be for the Black family, but a Black woman has been abused, a Black child has been killed by its father, why the father is being protected and the woman is not being protected. So that led her to create this organization that basically centers Black women. So I ended up becoming friends with her and doing some work with her. And through all of that, I was also having my own personal professional crisis where I'm just like, I can't waitress for the rest of my life, but I also don't want to work in fashion. And at that point, I started putting some ideas together for an organization that I had started calling Birthright Africa. And it was sort of from working from the side of like, what would I want people to do if I could send them to Africa just to experience that for once in their life. And through that, I went to try to register the domain for birthrightatafrica.com, and I saw that someone owned it. So I started doing research. And right around the time that I found who had the website, I also found that this person had just started working on the organization. Like they had done a GoFundMe and raised like $4,000 or $5,000 so that they could take some time, step away from their work to start putting the organization together. And that person ended up being Wala El Sheikh, who is the CEO of Birthright Africa. And she and I started talking, and her vision and my vision were very complementary, but I was working from a more programmatic side and she was working more organizationally. Her background is in business and education. So she was more so like into the fundraising, filing paperwork, and this and that. And I was like, no, I don't do that stuff. Like, I don't do paperwork. I want to plan trips. I want to put the trips together. So um, we ended up like mashing our ideas together and just forming this, just this concept for what this program could be. And that was at the beginning of 2015. No. Um, Actually, I can't remember. Yeah, it had to be at the beginning of 2015. Yes, because at the end of this year, it'll be 4 years done. Um, anyway, so we started doing that and we worked remotely for um, about a year and a half. And eventually we realized that we would have to go to Africa, and we had settled on Ghana as being the country. I actually didn't have Ghana in my mind. She is the one who had Ghana in mind. And when all was said and done, it is actually made the most sense. The reasons why we chose Ghana as our pilot country is because one, it's economically stable here and politically stable. So Ghana has elections and there is not violence surrounding them, which is pretty typical in a lot of African countries. Um, it is also very safe. Ghana is the safest country in Africa, and it's several times safer than the US. And it is also in West Africa, which we wanted to start in basically where people who would be joining our program, where one of their roots would be from directly. Um, and with it being in West Africa, there are only 4 countries in West Africa where they speak English, and this is one of them. So those are the reasons why we chose Ghana specifically. So we worked for about a year and a half remotely, and then it was actually right before my birthday in 2016. So in 2016, August, I basically left New Orleans and um, I went to California for a month to just like sort some things out, which actually leaving New Orleans was like the most hectic thing that I could do. It was just like, it just seemed like, when you can't do something and you just feel like this impending doom and you're just like, oh my God, this is so bad. This is so bad. And everything gets worse. And I literally got on a plane to go to California, and I got off the plane and I went to my friend's house and she was like, hey, you want to go see Grace Jones tonight? And I was like, oh, like this was like the best thing I could have possibly done. And then actually everything from there ended up being like really great. And I was really, really relieved and happy. Um, and although I miss New Orleans, I could not live there. Like my spirit was being like attacked, like on a psychic level. But yeah, so I went to New York after that, and that was actually the first time that Walla and I met. Um, and I had my birthday. And then, like 2 days later, we flew from New York City to Accra. And I remember being on the plane, and you know how they have on the seat in front of you, it has like the little cheap little graphic of like the world, and the little plane is a dot going across it. And like when it started to get close to the coast, I like it was dark outside at that point, but I woke up and I started like looking out the window, and like I feel like I can still even see it like right now. But like I was looking out the window and I could see darkness, and eventually I could start seeing like some lights like lining the what I imagine is the coast, and I was like, we're home. And um so the plane landed and we got off, and we actually like immediately like started to get into our itinerary because Birthright Africa offers a 10-day experience. So we had a 10-day pilot basically where she and I just um we I laid out the 10-day pilot, and we followed our itinerary to see um if it was just a feasible thing that could happen. So we we got off of the plane and we immediately went to this place called the New Bouquet Foundation. We met this like incredible educator named Abdullah, who told us about that organization, which they are a gallery, and they host contemporary artists as well as folk artists and art from antiquity. And the folk art that they host is actually very interesting because they support a program in, I think the city is called Wa. It's in the north of Ghana. And there's a school there for blind children. And because of the way things are here, like people who have disabilities like blindness are severely disadvantaged. Um, Boarding school is common here. Most people will have been sent away to some city where they'll be in boarding school. But so blind children are sent to this school in Wa. And there, New Bouquet supports them learning how to weave kente. And they're children basically, and they're master kente weavers. And the kente that they weave is so beautiful. It's like these beautiful textiles, and they can't see what they're doing, but they can clearly like they clearly know what they're doing. They've been trained, and they also it's just these beautiful textiles that they're making. um so that's one of the organizations that Du Bouquet supports, um which they are actually unfortunately closed right now for a remodel, but that's actually good because that means that they have gotten some money, some funding. So when they open back up, there'll be some new facilities there, which I'm excited to go to, because they host a lot of really incredible events, film screenings, openings, and things like that.
You said it was called Numuke?
New Bouquet, Nubuke.
So thank you.
Mm-hmm. So that was our first day. We went there. We went to our hotel. Um, the second day actually ended up going off the rails completely. We There's not a lot of information online. So a lot of places here don't keep up with the internet or their websites or things, which is really unfortunate. And I think that when I get to the part about the opportunities and challenges of the year of return, that is a big one. But the basically the National Museum was closed, and the Museum of Science and Technology was closed, and they're both still closed, and that was in October 16. Um, so we ended up having to go to the Art Center Market, which is sort of like it's a place where a lot of the artisans live. I need to plug my phone up. Sorry. I hope you didn't lose me. Okay. Um, we ended up having to go. Thanks. We ended up having to go to the art center market, which is like sort of like a hustler's paradise. Like all these people live there, and they're the artisans that make these things. But then there's all these shops where they sell what they make at overinflated prices, but it's like a tourist market. It's like the place where tourists are sent to get their things, even though you can find things at other places, but it's just like a giant marketplace, and it's right by the ocean. And so we went there and we made some friends, some people who actually like, they call me today. um, and we'll go have a drink or whatever. But yeah, we ended up going to that place, and they showed us around, and we ended up having like sort of like a more relaxed day, and that was really cool. Anyway, I don't need to detail the trip, but we went through our 10 days, and there were so many moments that were just like wild. So we went to the Cape Coast Castle, which I've actually calling Cape Coast Castle. I call it Cape Coast Dungeon now, because that is what it was for my ancestors. It was not a castle. Um, and I went live when I went with this year's cohorts, so that people who follow me on Facebook could actually see what that experience is like, even though it's really just going into like a cave and going down into like a dungeon, and it's dark. But that was so intense. It was so intense. And actually, I forgot. We went to a second castle. Actually, that was the second castle we went to. We went to another one called Elmina Castle, which is not that far away first. And at Elmina Castle, they have there was a smaller tour. So you go into this place. It's like a giant white building that's clearly like old, and it was actually first European the first European built building in Africa. So it's like the very first point of colonialism. Um, and there's a church in the center, and it's called the Portuguese Church. And that was actually the first building because the Portuguese were the first there. And then the Dutch came and they built the fort around it. And so before your tour starts, you're allowed to go into the church, and there's like these little like sandwich boards in there that have like all this information. And it's very, very strange because the information on it almost sounds like they are trying to downplay what happened there. Like it was like Dutch contributions to Ghana and things like that. And it's just like slavery, pestilence, war are not mentioned, but like words like bread and this and that. And it's just like this is goofy. Like so I'm looking at that stuff and I'm getting like kind of pissed off. And I'm walking through the church, and then there was like this building used to be an actual functioning church, right? And I get to one corner of the place, and there was just like this little cell in the corner, and it had like this tiny little door. It maybe was like 1.5 feet tall. And when I saw it, I just lost my shit. I was like, you motherfuckers are in a church, and you have some person getting on their knees and crawling into this hole. And I was just like, I do not know what God it is that you serve. It cannot be my God. I do not know this God. This God is a demon. Like, I just like lost it. And I just like started crying, and I ran out of the building. Now, there were some white people in that building, and one of them followed me out of the church. And I was sitting on the edge of the church, and I just had my head down, and he came outside, and he stood like directly in front of me with his arms crossed, and he's just looking at me. Now, in my mind, I wanted to curse him out like completely. But it just so happened that I was wearing like a Birthright Africa t-shirt. And so I was like, okay, like I cannot be like the real me in this t-shirt and say something to him. Um, so I got up and I went into another room, and at that point, or like into the lobby almost. And then the woman in his group came and she followed. And at that point, you have to stand in a certain place where you can see me because I've entered a doorway, like I'm in a room. And she's standing like outside of the doorway looking at me. And so at that point, I was like, okay, this is definitely deliberate. They are trying me. And I went and I told Walla, I was like, I don't think I can go on this tour right now. And she was like, yeah, I think it's for the best that you don't go. Because she's sort of like, we had been working remotely for like a year and a half at that point, but she's sort of like, she's also not African American or from the displaced diaspora. She is Sudanese American. So while she understands that experience, she did not have the connection to it that I have, like the same connection to it that I have. So she was like, yeah, you shouldn't go. So she went on the tour, and it actually ended up being the tour with those 3 people who they ended up being Italian. And when she came back, she was like, yeah, I don't think that would have been good for you to be on that tour with them, because they were sort of like laughing and like joking around with each other and like asking really silly questions like, oh, so like were people sad here? And like, I guess they asked her why I was crying. And it was just like, even at a bare minimum, if you did not know that I am African American and I have like a connection to this because of like my heritage and like my ancestry, like you could connect the dots that like this is a sad place and maybe that's why I'm crying. um so yeah, that was just real intense. And I sat on the stairs like staring at that church, and the sky was like really, really blue, but it was just like surrounded by this white wall. And I was just like, I wonder what people just felt like coming in here and just like seeing this is like the last sky they'll see, and it's just surrounded by this wall. It just felt like it was a prison. It was a dungeon. So yeah, that was really intense and tough, and I had a really bad experience there. But then when we went to the Cape Coast Castle, our group ended up being African American people, some Caribbean people, some Ghanaian people. So everyone was black, and everyone sort of like it was kind of a better group to do a tour like that with for me personally. And whew, that that was a better way to close it out than if that other experience had happened the other way around, or if we had only gone to the first place. But the following day, we ended up going to Kumasi, which is in the central region of Ghana. It's about a 5-hour drive from Accra. So when we got to Kumasi, I had planned for us to go to a artist residency called the Inca Foundation, NKA. And they are in this town called Abitinum. And it was like, you know how things just are how they're supposed to be sometimes? When we got there, the man who I was supposed to meet was there. He greeted us and everything, but he barely spoke to us because, and not like he didn't want to, he was there, but there was a professor from the university. His name is Dr. Jekdi Nyarko. He is a professor of sculpture at the University Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. And he's like my Ghanaian father now, actually, but he was there, and he was just like kicking knowledge that whole time. And I was like, he was like, my wife told me not to come here today, and I said no. I said I'd go, so I want to go. And it's kind of like it's purposeful because God brought me here, and He was talking to me about all these things that I didn't know. And like after having come from the castle, it was like it broke me down, and then like speaking to Him like built me back up. And I just felt like so connected and so like purpose driven, and like it was just amazing. One of the things that he told me that I will share with you, which is something that like people don't typically share with us because reasons that you can probably easily understand, but he shared with me that, like, yes, we all know the story of Africans selling Africans, but what we are not taught is that a lot of the kings who made money hand over fist selling other Africans from other tribes, so they have no allegiance to these people, right? But once they found out what was actually happening to them in the Caribbean, in the US, in Latin America and Central America, when they found out that they were being worked to death by the age of 20 and 25 and being forced to breed and things like that, they killed themselves because they recognized that what they had done was extremely, extremely dishonorable to their own legacies. Now, of course, that wasn't all of them, but there were a considerable number of kings who did. And suicide is not something to be taken lightly in African culture, especially, I mean, today definitely, but like especially back when we're talking about people practicing traditional African religions. This is pre-Christianity. You were not committing suicide was not a thing that you were supposed to do. So, yeah. So Dr. Jack DiNiarco just gave me so much knowledge and information, and he just built me back up, and I just felt so connected and so good after that experience. But yeah, so we did our 10 days and came back to the US. And because at that point I had left New Orleans, and I knew that I was going to not live back in New Orleans. And I knew that I didn't want to live in Chicago, and I couldn't move to New York, and I don't like LA. And there's just really no place that I really wanted to be in the US. After I experienced a cry, I said, well, my organization will be traveling there, so it'll be a strategic place for me to set myself up. So I should just move to Accra. So I ended up moving to Accra August 1st of 2017, just a few days before the 2017 cohort, which was the first group that Birthright Africa brought to Africa. They had just completed 7 Fridays, I should say, in New York City, where they did from 9 to 5. So the program works basically when you're in the program in New York City. So you do exploration on the national, international, and local level. So they started on the local level, and there's 7 Fridays in New York City where over the summer where we would all meet in a place where we would do a workshop or a panel. So we've gone to WeWork Harlem. We've gone to businesses that are owned, managed, or led by Black people. and we do a workshop or a panel, or the owner of the business shows us around and talks to us about what it is they do. But actually, the first thing that we do when we get there is we eat breakfast together. Then we do the panel. Then we go to lunch together, and then we go to a historically or culturally relevant site. Places like the African Burial Ground at Wall Street, Weeksville, which is the first African American community in the U.S. It was in Brooklyn, which we actually found out that the Seneca Village, the one that is under Central Park, is said to be the first one, but it actually was. It was a mixed neighborhood, sort of. It wasn't all black, but Weeksville was all black, and it actually had the first public school in New York. Public school number 1 is actually a black school, or PS number 1. I'm sorry, no, PS1 is the actual school, but the first actual public school that was in New York City was a black school. So that's what the program is like in New York City. They then go for 3 days to Washington, D.C., where we stay on the Howard campus. They go to the Smithsonian Museum, the new Smithsonian Museum for African American History and Culture. They do a workshop panel in Washington, D.C. when we were there. I don't remember the company name, but we had a woman who runs her own medical facility. There was also the woman who owns AfricanAncestry.com, where they can do your genetic testing and tell you which tribes you belong to, or ethnic groups, I should say. There was a black man who's opening charter schools in DC, and there's a man named Diallo Sumbri who he has an organization called the Birthright Movement, and that's who is partnered with Ghana to do this year of return. So they also do, I can't remember what else they do in DC. A lot of like tourist things too, like they walk the U Street and see all these historic sites in DC that were formative to like building the nation and what have you. And like this historic black community. So after the 3 days in DC, they go back to New York City, and then they prep for their trip to Ghana, and then they come to Ghana. So I was already here ahead of my first group that came. When they came, they were a group of 7, and they all had their lives changed by the experience. They all still talk to this day. They all talk to me to this day. They talk to a lot of the people who are on the panels and things.
Did you want to show it now or later?
Do I want to? Oh, you can show it now.
Okay, I can do that.
Yeah, so he's just going, and he's just going to show our promo video for basically that shows the impact that the trip had on our scholars for 2017.
Look at my fucking feed. Ignore my feed. It's a mess. Sorry, the internet's really slow on Facebook specifically for some reason.
How long is the video, by the way?
It was like 5 minutes, right?
Okay.
I don't remember specifically. I mean, this is fucking ridiculous. I'm gonna email it to myself because
Okay, I mean I can keep talking until you get it all. Let me know when you're ready. Um, so we had our 2018 cohort come in August of this year. Um, they were a group of 10. They also had their lives changed by this experience. They are having their Legacy of Innovation presentations on Tuesday, actually. So after they return from Ghana at the end of August, um, we give them a few months to process, and then they come back and they have we host an event where they're able to showcase the impact that this experience had on them. And so that is this Tuesday for this current cohort, the 2018 cohort. You can actually, I think we're going to broadcast it on Facebook Live if anyone's interested in checking that out.
You can send me the link and I'll post it on this stuff. I'm ready to show this.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. You're not going to hear anything because I'm going to mute the mic because of the audio issues, but.
Yeah.
Okay, you're good.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions about Birthright Africa, I can take those now because we have about like 35 minutes left, and I want to spend the last part talking about the year of return. So if anyone has any questions about Birthright Africa.
I have a couple, but let me let the audience go first.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. How are you funding? Hi, thank you for your presentation. How are you funding your travelers? Do they fund it like Return Israel, or are they funding?
Manny, can you repeat the question because I can't hear it as well as I can hear you?
Ask if the scholars are fully funded, or if it's a partial funding, or where does the funding come from? Also, more of a
okay.
You can answer some of it.
So the scholars don't pay for anything while they're in the program. They don't pay for food. They don't pay for their accommodations. They don't pay for, I should say, we pay for their food. We pay for their accommodations. We pay for their travel. They don't do any fundraising. It's their birthright, so it's something that's given to them as their right of being people born within this diaspora to have that experience. So it's given to them for free. We even give them bus passes with enough fare on it so that they can get to and from our program. So there isn't anything that they pay for within the program, other than if they want to buy souvenirs or things while they're traveling, or if they want to drink alcohol, we can't pay for that. But otherwise, everything else is provided for them. Our fundraising is so we actually are funded mostly by private donors at this point. A scholar costs anywhere between $3,500 and $5,000. So our executive board pays. Well, I don't want to say they pay, but there's a due for being in the executive board that goes towards funding scholars, and then the rest of it is mostly private donors.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yes, that answers that question.
I was kind of wondering. I mean, there's an elephant in the room of like capitalism and entrepreneurial spirit. Like, I think we all understand the necessity of, resilience in the context of neocolonialism and the repair of the diasporic relationship. But I'm wondering on this like focus on entrepreneurialism in the program. Like, I'm wondering if you can speak to that. And I'm sure that, of course, Walla has had undue influence in terms of like that kind of framing. But I would like to hear your perspective on it too.
Yeah, I think that you probably know that from private conversations, especially with. I am not one of those focused on like Black excellency framed through like a white lens, like sort of everything that's supposed to be like Black and excellent is like graduating from a university, which is like great. But what about, things that are outside of this achievement lens that would be applauded by the white supremacist power structure, So I personally like am having to contend with that myself on a personal level. However, there is the necessity, so it's not something that there is the necessity, but it's also not really something that I can push back on. So how I contribute and how I sort of create static to that is by sort of like infusing our programming with things that are outside of that. So we are, of course, modeled after Birthright Israel. We have no affiliation with them, but that's where the idea came to us from. And they offer 28 different trips. So I'm planning programming that goes, that offers more than just entrepreneurship, STEM, beta is actually what we call it, focused programming. I want to do an artist residency um, for artists. If you don't, if you're not particularly interested in this STEM sort of track, um, I also have plans for a. We're not calling it a service trip because we don't want it to have this Aid Africa viewpoint, but sort of like working with the community to address a challenge, um, which is I will get to in the next part where I talk about the year of return, but that is basically what people in Ghana and throughout Africa are looking to us for, is to help them address these challenges. So starting at that level of like building community and focusing on things outside of just like academic achievements and like entrepreneurship and STEM and things like that. Because while those things are important, so are the artists, so are um, the communities, building communities and things like that. So yeah, I personally, on a personal level, I have to contend with how focused we are on that, but it's also we're in our infancy, and we also have to prove our impact to donors and to the wider, just for our visibility, we have to prove our impact. And so those are the things that people are sort of like focused on right now: science, tech, engineering, math. But I actually created the term BETAs as our acronym. We're calling it Black STEM, and it's business, engineering, tech, the arts, and science, because um, I think that that's a more holistic approach. But yeah, don't really have a great answer for it, but there are some
No, that is a great answer. Thank you.
things.
Because I think we're aware that it's a two-person project and you have different views and different visions. So there's going to be organizational distinction, and like you have a different take on things. I was wondering if you could speak more about like your different programming goals and some of the different plans that you've laid out, what it's looked like so far, and what it will look like going forward.
So we're actually going to be scaling next year. We are going to ideally and God willing bring 4 or 5 groups next year instead of one. Our goal is to bring 80 people. Um, we will be expanding out of the New York City area into different regions, and I don't have that in front of me, but I have 5 years mapped out basically um, to expand to basically like the major metropolitan areas, New York, DC, Chicago, uh, probably LA, Houston. I don't actually remember which cities it is because I didn't actually do the mapping myself, but um, we're also going to start taking national enrollments. So, um, like how I just stated that the people who came, they did 7 weeks in New York City together. Excuse me, and then they went to Washington D.C. together. Once we do national enrollment, it'll be sort of an independent study type thing. When you go to apply, you will have had to have checked off certain things, like you went on your own to an African American, to a cultural or heritage site locally. You will have had to go on your own to meet with an entrepreneur or a business owner in your city. And those are the things that let us know that you're serious about it, because we won't be able to engage with you and meet with you weekly. Um, and then they would go to Washington, D.C., and that's where they would meet their cohort. And then they would travel to Ghana from there. We also will be scaling into other countries in Africa over the next 5 years. So that's what we're looking like from the organizational side as far as programming. I do plan to introduce to pilot a trip that is outside of the betas programming that we're currently doing, into either most likely a combination of like a residency that is also focused on addressing a community challenge. I envisioned this sort of like, if someone is a painter or an artist or something, they can come and they can host a class in the community, and they'll do that for a few weeks. But at the same time, they'll have space and time to work on their own art. And I mean, this is all still in development, so, but there's definitely, I'm thinking about it, and I'm definitely open to ideas if anyone has any vision that they think could fit into our model. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I was wondering if you could also maybe talk about, and this is more like speculative or, you know, your own promotions or ideas, but what other countries you would take people to if not Ghana? Because I feel like Senegal would be really good. Dakar would be awesome.
Yeah, I actually plan on going to Senegal to, I mean, Afropunk, of course, is not cute anymore, but they're having one in Dakar for the first time. I think it's in May, so I'm planning on going, which will also coincide with some of the work that I'm doing with Unbox Africa, which I haven't gotten to talk about much, which also isn't launched, but yeah, I'm planning to have a trip to Dakar coincide with that. So Senegal is high on our list. Also, Rwanda is extremely high, because Rwanda has basically like turned their country around from a genocide 20 years ago to the most progressive country in Africa, as far as like infrastructure, governments, et cetera, et cetera. Although they have their own challenges again, Paul Kagame has been in power for a really long time, and it's starting to become a dictatorship. And people are starting to not like that. There was also the woman who wanted to run against him, who had been jailed and humiliated sexually by having nudes of her leaked, which may not even be real. So, you know, there's a lot going on, but as far as like what Rwanda has going on, they've really, really developed their country very, very quickly and very, very well. And a lot of the other countries in Africa are sort of looking to them as like the model for how to replicate the success. So they're really high on our list. Kenya is really high on our list as well. And Nigeria also has a lot of interesting and cool projects going on. So it's all just, we haven't necessarily mapped out which ones we're going to quite yet, but we'll be doing that over probably 2019. And yeah, I'm excited for that, because that's what I look forward to as like the African program director, is like really like what we can expose people to on this side. So yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have any more questions?
Any other questions before the year of return?
Just really quickly, what is Unbox? Was it Unbox?
Oh yeah, are you allowed to talk about Unbox Africa at all, or I think people are interested.
No, I am. It's my company, so yes, I can talk about it.
Well, I don't know.
so
Masters and stuff.
it's Unbox Africa is a company that I'm launching before the end of this month. That is basically there's it's starting out as a subscription box of locally sourced artisanal natural handmade goods from a select city within Africa, or I should say a select region within Africa. So the first box will be curated in Accra, um, and the box will come with goods that like elevated goods. So things that are from companies that are small, but they have really great products and they are able to meet a demand. If I send out 100 of their products to a client base in the U.S., they can meet the demand if those people come back as customers later. It'll also have some local arts and some curated contents, digital content, as well as a magazine that sort of like profiles the vendors and artisans in sort of like a Humans of New York style profile, um, which that is the beginning levels, which is what I'll be traveling to Dakar with, so I can get some really good content to share about Dakar from the Afropunk Festival. As well as like there's so much, I mean, there's so much, Africa's huge, but uh, yeah, so I'll be traveling to different countries every 2 months to sort of curate a box of elevated goods and art for a US based clientele, which will hopefully expand into Europe and the UK shortly after that, as well as into high end contemporary art dealing, as well as travel stuff and media things. So it's not, we're launching next month. I'm sorry, at the end of this month, but I have a solid vision for what I see for this company, and yeah, it's basically a subscription box for right now. A really high end, elevated, curated subscription box, but a subscription box nonetheless.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'll start talking about the year of return then.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, so the year of return is commemorating 400 years since the slave trade began. I personally, so there's going to be events all throughout the year throughout Ghana. None of the other countries are commemorating the year of return, but I also think this date is specific to Ghana. The Sorry, I just got distracted because I think someone's listening to church music. It's like 4:45, and I don't know why anyone is up besides me. But yeah, this is specific to Ghana. There will be events every month. I just recently got an itinerary. It doesn't have a lot of details, but it basically is telling me what events are happening which month. I don't have the days yet. But yeah, there's concerts, there are conferences, travel things like all over the country. So that's basically what it is. There are a few problematic issues that I have with the year of return, which I'm considering doing a video about soon, which is that Yeah, I'll start with the bad first, and then I'll go on to the good. We'll end on a high note. There are a lot of promises being made. First of all, they're targeting African Americans for this year's return, which I think is already problematic because people were taken all over the Caribbean, all over to Latin America, Central America, and North America. And I think it's problematic to only target African Americans. Secondly, there are a lot of promises being made about what people can look forward to when they get to Ghana if they choose to repatriate. And I can tell you that a lot of that stuff is completely unrealistic. I presently cannot even find the form to get Birthright Africa registered as a company in Ghana so that I can get a work visa here. Now I could go somewhere and I could pay someone to give me the form. If I don't pay for it, I won't get the form, which is going to be a turnoff for a lot of people coming from outside of Africa because we're not used to this overt bribery system. I told Walla that I was told that like I would have to buy a woman a tank of gas to give me the papers, and she was like, don't pay for that because we don't want to be caught up in any sort of scandals like that. I wasn't going to pay her because I was just like, what? That doesn't sound right to me. But those are things that are going to be hindrances to people's desire to come back. There's also the fact of there being a job shortage here. A lot of people are unemployed. So I think it would be unrealistic for people to come here and think that they could just get a job. Because for one, you would need a work visa, which you can't get. And then for two, people are looking to the diaspora to come back and to bring something. Like they need us to bring things like skills, tools, knowledge, right? So to come here and to look for a job is sort of not going to go anywhere for people. And then on top of it, like you're sort of expected to bring something more to the table than that. Like creating a company where you can employ people is going to be more beneficial for society here. There's also an issue here where the rents are out of control. Ghana is the most expensive country in Africa. I've heard, but I've also heard that Angola is also extremely competitive with the rents. But the difference, and this is what I'm hearing from people who are African and who have traveled extensively, is that Angola makes money. Like there's money being made there, whereas Ghana is it's not a wealthy country like that. There are wealthy people here, of course, but it's not a wealthy country like that, where there's just a lot of money being circulated. So that is an issue. And on top of that, you have to come and you have to pay 2 years rent up front. So if you have to pay $500 rent, and that's on the low end, $500 rent, and you have to pay 24 months of $500 up front, that is what, $12,000? So that cost is something that a lot of people don't know, and it's going to hinder people from being able to integrate themselves into society because you can't save $12,000 living in the U.S. as like just a regular person. People don't have that kind of savings, and especially to put towards something that you have no idea what the outcome of it is going to be. So there's also a lot of issues with the actual infrastructure. Power goes out, water goes off, um, which are manageable, but they're just things that people aren't used to. For me, they're manageable. But when Walla was here, and Walla is Sudanese, she had a big problem with like the electricity being out. I didn't have as big of a problem with it, um, but that's something that will affect people's desire to live here. And that's one of the things that I was talking about with living in Mexico that prepped me for living here, because in Mexico the water would go off, the power would go off. So um, there's just a lot of small things that are going to be difficult for people to want to come here for. Aside from them already having to tackle their own, well, I won't say their own, but the conception that has been given to us of Africa, um, which some of it is true, some of it is exaggerated, some of it is not true. Um, and things are different all over this continent. There's so many places here. It's huge. So yeah, there's a lot that I think is not being talked about and is being overlooked in this um, invitation. Also, that's the big thing, is that this invitation is to us to come here when there is actually not um, any sort of system in place really to integrate us into society. Like, even myself as like one person of like a few, there's like maybe, I think something like 100,000, maybe 400,000 African Americans here right now. I could be wrong. Um, but um, they only awarded citizenship to like 30 people, like in 2014 or 15 or something. They don't have the capacity to. They don't have the capacity to do that. It's not possible. And then, like I was talking about with websites and things like that, you can't find information online. People work for the government and they're using Yahoo, AOL, Hotmail, and Gmail accounts. So you don't even know, you know what I mean? There's like no official log of things. It's just um, there's some housekeeping that needs to be done before such an event can occur. But yeah, those are a lot of the challenges. But as far as the opportunities, there's so much opportunity here because we are in a developing nation. There's a lot of room for development. There's a lot of room to take something that people are doing. There's a professor, Dr. Erin Ofori. She's actually not a professor anymore, I don't think. I mean, obviously, she's still an educator, but she now works with helping people repatriate to Ghana. She's consulting people for that. But she was saying, imagine what it would be like if people could come from the diaspora with skills and knowledge of how to do things, and they could team up with someone here who has let's take, for example, shea butter. I know a man, just to team up and to create something new and to streamline a process and to make it profitable, to bring money into the country. So I know a man who has a friend who is from a village where they make shea butter. So he went to this village and they started a company, and now they are going to be doing shea butter in like this new innovative way, which is obviously still just shea butter, but there's a way that they're packaging and branding that is unlike how it's done. Like, typically you'll see shea butter being sold just in a big Ziploc bag with like a sticker label. So they're upgrading and updating that elevating that experience. There's also there's just a lot of room for things here that are traditional to be updated, upgraded, the way that things are made, and sort of be able to get these artisans and artists paid for it, because people want these things, but it's just like the systems are just not working for. The systems just aren't working. There's so many opportunities here. There's opportunities in agriculture. That's a big thing. I was reading the other day that something like in Nigeria, they are the second largest producer of tomatoes, but they're also the largest importer of tomatoes. And that's because half of the tomatoes don't even make it to market because they rot. So many things just require a simple solution, right? And there's all these small solutions all over the continent, but that we have to figure out how to get them across the continent, instead of this person having this thing in Senegal, this person having this thing in Rwanda, this person having this thing in Mali. Like, those things need to be accessible to everyone all over the continent if it works, right? So there's huge opportunities in agriculture. There's huge opportunities in tech. Everyone here is like, all of the young people, I should say, a good percentage of young people, I don't want to say all, but if you have a reasonable amount of privilege and you were able to go to university or go through some sort of schooling, almost everyone has coding skills. Like, tech is like the thing. There's so many tech opportunities, or I shouldn't say opportunities, but there's so many people who are in tech that there needs to be just some sort of funnel to like getting all of these things. And it's just like, all of these people here are in tech and we don't even have centralized government emails, like there's just a lot of disconnect between a lot of systems, and there's opportunities to build and grow. And like Manny was saying the other day, like we were talking about, he was like, they were like, the system works, it just doesn't work for us. And I was like, well, it's sort of different here, because the system isn't necessarily working. It's barely working. And the beauty of it is that you have the opportunity to change it, because it's not supposed to be not working for people. Like, there's no blueprint. People have no idea how to do this stuff, just the way that we're operating from. So there's just so many opportunities for growth and development in every sector. And we also have to rush and do it before the Chinese do it, because they're going to be owning Africa soon, and that's not going to be good. So, yeah, I would say that the vision for the future is wide open. The future of Africa is wide open. People just have to make their plays, and we have to hope for the best. And there's a position that everyone can play, even at home in the U.S. One of the things that we like to say at Birthright Africa is that, like, our birthright as Black people is not just Africa. We belong everywhere, all over the world. If you want to position yourself somewhere and you want to execute your dream and your vision, you can do that anywhere, because as Black people, we were already all over the world. We are entitled to that, for as much labor as we have put into this planet to mine everything that keeps everything going, to contribute labor and resources. We don't have to sequester ourselves in Africa. We can if we want to, but if you choose to be anywhere in the world, you can do that. So, I just think that there's a lot of opportunity, and the future can be bright. And I try to remain hopeful, even in the face of like all the times where Ghana is really frustrating for me. But yeah, I'm excited for the future, and we'll see what this year of return brings. And I do plan on using my voice to sort of um, let the government and organizers know that, like, we're not prepared for this. We have to do more to prepare. So yeah. Are there any questions? I know we're like closing, getting close to time.
I was wondering, what is that conversation like? Does there exist a conversation between Birthright Africa and the year of return from the state of Ghana?
So the year of return is uh, organized by an African American man, the man Diallo Sumbri, who does the Birthright movement. So he and I personally are friends, and we talk. He his organization works with the government here. But this conversation that I'm talking about is not. It's honestly like something that like I knew in my mind, but I honestly just got really frustrated a few days ago, and I was just like, this is just unrealistic. Somebody needs to say something. So this is sort of like a new thing that I'm just like sort of like really like grasping onto. Um, but yeah, I am going to talk to him, and I am going to try to get some conversation started about that, because it's totally necessary. Like, we can't invite all these people. You can't, like, you don't invite people to a party and you don't have food and drinks and napkins and stuff. Like, like you have to, when you invite guests, you have to have something there for them. So, um, yeah, so it's not pre-existing, but I know the avenues to have this conversation. Any other questions?
I suppose just quickly, so what are some of the, I guess, cultural differences that you have to adjust to, like some of the ones that stand out the most in your mind?
Yeah, you
That
mentioned
is
this
not.
being treated differently abroad. I was wondering if specified. I mean, Black Americans.
Yeah, that is not a quick question.
Okay. Okay,
um,
so pick the one thing that's, I guess, standing out in your mind right now.
Or three. Pick three.
Okay.
okay. Uh, three cultural differences. Okay, so I'll start with the view of African. I'm sorry. Yeah, African Americans abroad. So one thing that consistently happens, we have had to start telling our scholars not to give their phone number to everybody, because people here use WhatsApp. Um, and they have had people befriend them and then, later ask them for money or something like that, which sort of colors like their experience. And it's also just like, um, they're students, so it's not like they have all this money. And then on top of it, it's like, it's it's almost, I don't know how to say this, like, it's just, it's not how we need to be connecting. Like, I'm all for direct donations and things like that, but I don't necessarily think that the people who are asking because they're hungry. They're asking because you're American and you're supposed to have money, right? um, so that's a huge issue. um, There's just like some bug that just flew and I just tried to kill, which isn't one of my things, but also like the bugs here are big and crazy. um, so there's that. There is the things with having to deal with like official government things where you are made to sort of like have to bribe people into doing things, which is not, which is a barrier to progress. You can't expect that, like if you have people who have great ideas and they need to meet with someone, but you can't set up the meeting with them unless they pay you, that idea is never going to get off the ground. It's like impeding your own progress with bribery and like this. And I get it because these jobs don't pay a lot. They don't really pay a living wage. So people have to create their own avenues to make money, right? So if you know that I need you to get from A to B, you're going to monetize point A, right? But if you're gatekeeping point B, then what's, you know what I mean? It's really. Um, there's also the Uber drivers here are, whew, there is a, so I mean, this is probably also me being spoiled and bratty. I will like 100% fully admit that. But like, it's like every single Uber driver does not know how to get around Accra. And it's like, I've been living here for a year now, and I pretty much know how to get around like pretty well. These are people who have never left Accra their whole life, and they don't know how to go places. And it's just, it's really, really frustrating for me personally, because that's like, I just have road rage. That's just like one of my personal issues with myself, is that like I get in a car and I get pissed off like immediately, whether I'm driving or not. And so, yeah, the Uber drivers are just a nightmare to have to deal with. Um, and that's on top of just like even American Uber drivers. It's just like it's another layer of hell dealing with the Uber drivers here. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. Also, I think that yeah, just the perception of being like American here is really, really, it's a hard one to navigate, because I've heard people say things like, "Oh, I wish that my grandparents had gotten taken." And that's like a really ugly thing to hear for me. And I can't explain to them that, like, well, I mean, let's just say that they had gotten taken. You probably wouldn't be here, because most of those people died in the ocean coming over. And then a lot of them died during those 400 years of slavery. And then very, 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 very few of us actually made it to the point where we became African Americans in today's society. Um, and even still, like one of my friends, Russell, said it to me, and I told him, I was like, "You are a dark skinned, like big black man. Like, you'd be in prison. Like, that's not what you want. You don't want that for your grandparents to have gone over there. Like, you would literally be in prison." Um, so um, there's that. There was also an incident. I meant to bring this up during my challenges thing. There was an incident where I went to a fashion show, and everything was just, it was a graduate school fashion show, and everything was normal, just a graduate school fashion show, nothing out of the ordinary. And then one of the students' presentation was, her theme was the transatlantic slave trade, and she had her models like walking down the runway like they were injured, and they had all these chains, and like she sewed tatters into like these garments, and it was just like the most tasteless, disgusting, horrific thing I had ever witnessed with my eyes. And like, I wrote an email to the administration, and it was just sort of like, oh yeah, there's like an educational disconnect between that. And it's really, really painful, right, to have to see something like that from another black person, and like acknowledge that like they really don't know, but you have to know on some level of just being a human that like that's That's not like a fashion. Um, and those are things like that would really make that have made it hard for me to sort of like feel like not necessarily for myself, but I definitely struggled with those incidents. But I know that like other people are not going to be able to take that. It's just really, it's really gross, and I don't know, it just leaves you feeling like it's like the sense of community isn't there, or that people don't understand like that narrative. People like to tell you your narrative here. Like they like to tell you what it's like to be an African American, what it's like in America. And it's like you're telling me what my life is like, you're telling me what my community and my ethnic group is like, and you're not letting me tell you what it's like. And so that's really difficult. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have much more to say about it, but yeah, that's a really difficult thing to have to deal with on a regular basis.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any last words?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all for showing up. I really appreciate it. And also thanks to Manny, thanks to Homeschool and Ori Gallery.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ori. Okay,
so I'm gonna sign off, and maybe I'll see you all in your return.
We got 12K.
Bye.